transmitter power regulations, data emission standards. What's the maximum transmitter power an amateur may use on 10.140 megahertz? That is here in the 30-meter band, and the maximum power there is the 200 watts peak envelope power that you see on the graph there. Okay, 200 watts PEP output. What's the maximum transmitting power an amateur station may use on the 12-meter band? 12 meters is right here. Do you see any power restrictions there? No. So the power restriction that is applied generally to all the bands is the 1500 watt PEP output. What's the maximum bandwidth permitted by FCC rules for amateur radio stations when transmitting on upper sideband frequencies in the 60-meter band? If you look right here, in little tiny letters there, it says USB only, 2.8 kilohertz. So the correct answer is 2.8 kilohertz. Which of the following is a limitation on transmitter power on the 14-meter band? This is a slightly tricky question because, yes, you can. We're talking about the 14 megahertz band, 20 meters, and you don't see a power restriction there, which means that you can use up to 1500 watts, but there is a universal power rule that applies to all frequencies that says only the minimum power necessary to carry out the desired communication should be used. This is probably the most violated rule in amateur radio, is using more power than is necessary to carry out the desired communication. And partly it's because sometimes the equipment isn't capable of having the power reduced, and sometimes we're just lazy. The radio's on 50 watts, and you're talking to a repeater you could do on half a watt, but you don't reduce the power. You just go ahead and use the 50 watts. Which of the following is a limitation on transmitter power on the 28 megahertz band? Down here we do not see any power restrictions, so it's the maximum power allowed for amateur radio, 1500 watts PEP output. Which of the following is a limitation on transmitter power on the 1.8 megahertz band? Again, we do not see any power restrictions in here. So it's going to be the 1500 watts PEP output. What's the maximum symbol rate permitted for radio teletype or data emissions on the 20-meter band? I'm going to give you at the end of these questions, I have a summary of this, but in the below 28 megahertz, on the 20-meter bands at 14 megahertz, below 28 megahertz, the maximum symbol rate is 300 baud. And we see that for both of these questions. What's the maximum symbol rate permitted for radio teletype or data transmitted at frequencies below 28 megahertz? So that applies for this question and for this question, is 300 baud. What's the maximum symbol rate permitted for radio teletype or data emission transmitted in the 1.25 meter and 70 centimeter bands? That is 5.6 kilobaud. 5.6 kilobaud for the 1.25 meter and 70 centimeter bands. What's the maximum symbol rate permitted for radio teletype or data emission transmissions on the 10-meter band? That is 1200 baud. 1200 baud is the maximum symbol rate. What's the maximum symbol rate permitted for radio teletype or data emission transmissions in the 2-meter band? It's 19.6 kilobaud. 19.6 kilobaud. Here's the symbol rate summary, and I think if you printed what I gave Joe as the material to be downloaded for this, I think it's in there. But here are the maximum permitted symbol rates. Below 28 megahertz, it's 300 baud. in the 28 megahertz band is 1200 baud. For 6 meters and 2 meters, it's 19.6 kilobaud. For 1.25 and 70 centimeters, it's 56 kilobaud. And for frequencies higher than 70 centimeters, there's no maximum rate specified.